Hello, dear audience. Welcome back, and we're back too with a Feast of Healthy Thoughts. Christ says that He is the life and the giver of life, and He is the light. And we're going to continue our topic on transfiguration, where we see Christ transfiguring in front of His disciples and showing the uncreated light of God. Presbyter Yaki and I will continue to reveal all the nuances of transfiguration. This happens, as I said last time, 2,000 years ago, and through so many centuries it has kept its power, its mysteriousness, and has spoken to so many hearts. But we also see that throughout the centuries Christ has spoken and revealed Himself to many, many saints in the traditional Orthodox Catholic Church. And many people have communicated with Christ and become saints. This uncreated light penetrated inside of them. So it is possible to communicate to this light. This is our purpose today, Presbytera, to show some rays of this uncreated light through our discussion, because Christ says, I am the Word also. And this is a word that goes to our audience. And through this word, I would like to reveal some of this light.
When we were talking about the uncreated light of God, Christ being God and overwhelming His friends with His presence just by revealing Himself. All He did was reveal Himself. He who is with the world from before the world was created. And so Moses and Elijah are at His left and right, showing to them and to us that He was there before, during, and after that moment. One of the things we said in our previous discussion on the Transfiguration is, how do we make ourselves more open to this for our own lives? And you remembering when you came with your family to our little parish, which was so fun, of St. Nicholas up in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the Feast of the Transfiguration, and my husband gave a sermon that really struck you. And I'm so happy about that. And what you came away with, and you said to listen. Blessed are those who hear the word of God and keep it. And you were saying that kind of listening, though, is a different, you were implying it was a different kind of discipline, where it's a subtle breath almost. Sometimes God does not clobber us over the head most of the time. Usually it's quieter, more subtle. We have to sort of discern in a peaceful way how to proceed minute by minute in a way that expresses our following to what we're listening for, which is the love and the will of God. And so that's the process that will lead us to God's light. We can't do it. That's not in our power for God to reveal Himself to us. In fact, we can blow it, just as the disciples who were on the mountain, and we were able to piece this together from the three accounts of the Transfiguration story, that they were overcome with fatigue, they were overcome with tiredness. If it were up to them, they would have messed it up. Just like me, just like so many of us, we would mess things up. And so that's a relief, because even as we mess things up, but still our inner heart says yes, as we mess things up. God knows our hearts. And He's there and will reveal Himself to us as much as we are able to bear, as He discerns the time. And so in the end, all we can do is the best we can do, open ourselves, listen with the depths of our being to the subtle breath of God's loving will for us, and see what happens. It's God's job to do all of that. All we can do is show up. And so what does that mean in everyday life? It means, as you started to say, to listen. The second thing it means is, yes, it does mean to pray. And to pray, as we said in our previous episode, to enter our closet, meaning a private place, a private space, to pray with God alone. And sometimes that can be a minute. Sometimes it can be when we're driving the car safely. Sometimes it can be a special time. Hopefully we will have special times during the day when we can do that, but we don't have to always wait till 9 p.m. to have my private moment with God. We can make a private moment at any time of the day that these things fall together. We also pray with people we love. What Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I also amongst them. That's very important for us. And so there are many ways of opening ourselves up to the love of God through prayer. First, in our closet, second, with others, and then with larger groups as we worship together as the church. Third, Christ is in our midst. He is and always shall be. This is an ancient affirmation that is said in our liturgies at every Eucharistic service. And to my knowledge, this also occurs in Roman Catholic liturgies and in many Protestant liturgies that follow the formal tradition. And so if Christ is in our midst now, and he always will be, it means he's with us as we engage the liturgy after the liturgy. When we leave the church, there's the Liturgy of Life that we are invited to take part in just by breathing and walking and doing what we have to do. And so nothing is cut off from the love of God. I think sometimes some of us think, well, if I'm going to encounter God's love, I have to do it alone. There are times for private prayer. But also sometimes loving our neighbor. And well, who's our neighbor? Well, the Greek says the neighbor is opplision, the stranger who happens to be next to me, is a way of engaging the love of God. This is good in God's sight. And so the paradox of privately making this commitment, privately in our quiet, most private moments, to dedicate ourselves to God and listen for God, and then, as best as we know how, be open to that same reality being true through the rest of our lives, is a challenge. And I think it's a gift and opportunity also.
Jesus himself got tired sometimes. What do you think about that kind of tiredness? Why did he get tired?
He got tired because he's God, but he was also God and human. And so remember the story in the scriptures about the lady who was many years with the hemorrhage, and she'd been to many doctors and not been cured, been to the priests, not through their prayers, not been cured. And the Lord was walking through the town and people were pressing up against him, but she comes and touches the fringe of his garment. And because of her faith and love and trust in him, she was healed immediately. And so Jesus stops and says, who was that? Who touched me? And his disciples are saying, Lord, everybody's touching you. What are you talking about? He says, no, somebody touched me. I felt the power leave me. He felt it as the person, the second person that he is of the Trinity, but also the second person incarnate in his body. He felt it. And so, I don't know what it was for the Lord to be human, or for him to be human, but obviously he got tired. Obviously he had limitations. He died. So of course he would get tired. So even though he was God, he enjoyed all the fullness of what it meant to be human except sin. So I guess that meant fatigue, despite raising people from the dead.
And obviously here, in this particular case, when he goes with his disciples, sometimes he would go without the disciples, he would go by himself, alone. Another example for us to sometimes just be ourselves and God. And that's the best way of recovering from the tortures of the life that we...
I think we need all of that. And sometimes it's, as they say in medicine, PRN, as needed. So, but I think we need all of it. So sometimes it will be that private, go into our closet, get realigned, and offer ourselves to God and listen. Other times we have to pick up the 500-pound phone and call a friend to talk and to share, or to have that friend pray with us. Sometimes just asking for a loving conversation with someone. That's what we have to do in the moment. And somehow our having the courage and the integrity to admit I've got to call a friend and ask for help or ask for a loving conversation is what's needed. And so that's what has to happen. And so to sort of listen in the moment what is authentically needed in that moment, PRN, as truly needed. What's the medicine that needs to be prescribed at that moment?
I would like to speak about this being alone reality, because it's obviously part of Christ's life. He withdraws and he's alone in the desert. And when we see here, I don't know what happened when he was completely alone, but since we have this one, the disciples were there and they described it, is when he's alone, he communicates with a different dimension of reality with the saints. And the Orthodox explanation is that this is another encounter of communion with saints, that living people on the earth can communicate with the saints, and Christ was talking to them and they were talking to Christ. But obviously this is a different dimension of existence. You're communicating not with the disciples, obviously him was communicated with disciples, but was communicating with some other people or saints who were not in body anymore, who were up in the heaven. This was natural for Christ. He would go, and here go, he has the connection, and he talks to them. For us, I have read many times in the teachings of the Desert Fathers that if somebody wants to go to the desert, it's not the solution, that's the first step. But many, many people who went to the desert, they took the world with them. And the teachers or the fathers that would instruct them, they would say, it doesn't matter if you're physically out of the world. If you have that in your mind, if you have brought the memories and you're living with your memories still in the world, you don't have anything to do here. And the opposite is also true, I think. Somebody can be living in the world, which would be kind of difficult, but yet be alone, have private moments with God. What would you speak about this? How would this be possible? How can someone do this? Now we don't have the other side very much. We cannot go to the desert. And many, many people, especially in America, are very isolated and spend very individualistic life, but yet they are not alone. They have all these worries and difficulties and arguments in their minds when they go home after work, so they're not alone, even they live alone.
And there's two types of aloneness. One is isolation, being in isolation, and you're pointing to a nuance to the isolation where sometimes we're isolated, but we don't even know we're isolated. That's scary. I just need to comment on that a minute with you because usually when I talk about isolation, I'm thinking about we know we're isolated and we know we're feeling alone. And that's when I said earlier, just a few minutes ago, or if I said it in the previous episode, now it's all starting to blur, that we have to pick up the 500-pound phone and ask for help from people who love us or people we love and humbly receive that gift that they can give, whatever they can give. And so that's one kind of isolation, but the kind of isolation you're talking about is to be drowning in memories, to be drowning in experiences, to be drowning in connections or the image of relationship or dysfunctional relationship, but really just be isolated. There's no real life-giving reciprocity going on. It's either authentic relationship where there's something real going on, or inauthentic. Maybe there's something in between, but let's say, or inauthentic, where it's life-effacing, and it sucks the life out of you. And so it's easy to be alone and not even realize you're isolated because you're fighting all the paper tigers. Hello, I do that several times a day, and at least I think I'm getting a little better to catch myself. Oh my gosh, why am I fighting that battle, which may never ever happen, and not just be present today with what's on my plate today? You know, with the Lord's Prayer, we say, give us today our daily bread. It's not worrying about next week's daily bread or next year's daily bread. Give us today's daily bread. That's an important dimension of what it means to walk in God, trusting in the integrity of the life that's been given to us, that God will provide as long as we do what we're supposed to be doing today. And so we can be isolated, we could be, and I'm just so scared with all of the fun toys that we have, the tools that are also toys, to never realize how isolated we are, how lonely we are, because we're distracted. So we can be isolated and not even know it. Then there's the other kind of aloneness, and that is the time to be solitary. And that's the kind of aloneness you're also talking about, of entering the closet to pray. Or when Jesus made space between himself and his friends and his followers from his teaching ministry and went to a private place, a lonely place, some of the scriptural accounts say, to be with God. That's a kind of aloneness that's healthy and connected. So when we are solitary, it's a kind of aloneness where we are connected to God and all that God is connected to. And then there's the other kind of aloneness where we are isolated and we're just in our own feedback loop that goes over and over again. And it's really not life-giving, but boy, it's so close. It feels like life, and then we get fooled by that. But it's really feeding our own isolation. It's an important nuance to keep in mind. Am I solitary? Am I connected to God and truth and trying to do what I'm supposed to be doing? And that's a good thing. Or am I acting as an isolated individual?
The aloneness, obviously, is a way of communicating with God. Can we say that isolation is being separated from God. I want to say that the world is going towards the isolation right now.
Absolutely. And there's like an in-between point. And the in-between point for me is, you said loneliness. And loneliness is important to discern what kind of loneliness is it. No one likes to feel loneliness. And so as soon as we feel lonely, many of us will go do something. We might hang out with friends, but really not address the loneliness. Or we might go do some other action to sort of numb the pain of the loneliness. It could be drinking, eating, television, some other behavior, some other good habit gone bad, or some other bad habit gone worse, to cover up that emptiness that we feel in that loneliness. And so, but there's a kind of loneliness in our soul that is reserved only for us and God. And so to avoid experiencing that at all costs, cuts ourselves off from our own experience, cuts ourselves off from our own growth and becoming the persons we're called to be. So it's a sacred and holy loneliness. And even Jesus, as a human person, expressed that loneliness. And we've talked about that in the past on these conversations, where he would say, the birds have their nests and the foxes have their dens, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's a cry coming out of a deep place of loneliness and wanting connection with others who love him. And I really think it was human connection.
I sometimes find myself enjoying very much a company of a person who resonates the same way. It makes you completely happy. And then yet you spend all your day within the world, with the people, and at the end of the day you come out empty. This, I think, speaks about two things. That first is we need recharging, and the second is that we don't have enough to give. If we feel empty after one day, that means that there was nothing in there to give, and whatever was there is gone.
Our second book that St. Catherine's Vision has been writing, called Encountering Women of Faith, Volume 2. So we have Encountering Women of Faith, Volume 1, and Encountering Women of Faith, Volume 2. There's a story in Volume 2 where the author, and her name is Valerie Zahirsky, who's of Armenian extraction, and she's the wife of an Orthodox priest also, and a graduate of St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary in New York, and a good friend, someone I love and respect, writes a chapter on 4 women saints. And the fourth one is Mother Maria Skoptsova, a woman who lived and died during World War II, was a nun, married, had children, actually divorced twice, and yet was recognized as a saint through how her life unfolded. Now, she became a nun, kind of a rebel nun, as one of the books dedicated to her biography addressed her as a rebel nun, that she opened her little home in Paris to all the indigent poor that could come, especially during World War II, where French Jewish persons had to be hidden from the Nazis. And Valerie does a beautiful job describing her life, but there's a point in the story where Mother Maria is saying to a friend who's visiting, "See, this is my life. Look." And this person stays with her the whole day and sees that her house is an open door, and then she's seeing 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 people in a day. And she said, "I get no rest. I get no rest. This is what I do all the time." And so it made me think of the Lord saying, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. This was her life of sacrifice. And there comes a point where you've heard me say Christians are called to agape love, which is that self-sacrificial love. But we have to be discerning how and when and where. And this was her cross. And so, as you've heard me joke in the past, we're called to hang on the right cross. And this was her cross, to give herself unconditionally to the point of exhaustion. Now, we're told that when she was, in the end, sent to the prison camp and she died in the gas chambers, just a few days before the prison camp was liberated. Even the reports that we have that Valerie points to is that even there she lived a life of sacrificial love to the people that came to her, and she offered comfort to, even in the midst of a living hell. And so, when is it isolation that we just need to get restored? And when is it the isolation of, okay, this is the right cross? That might have to be discussed in another episode.
I would like to speak about the message that we kind of touched a little bit. This is my son. God the Father reveals to the disciples here and to all the crowd that was coming to the Jordan when he was baptized, when Christ was baptized. This is my son. And in the Orthodox explanation or interpretation, I find this other expression. He did not become the Son of God, but he was the Son of God. And he is and he will always be. Now I would like to speak about this message that comes from the Father, saying, this is my son. The importance of it, and what does it mean for us? We are children of God too. We know that we become His children through our baptisms. But in this case, we see a direct answer. This is my son.
I'm glad you pointed it out to me, because that's reminding me, not everybody who professes that they're Christian, in our opinion, is Orthodox. And I'm so sorry, I'm not trying to sound triumphalistic, but it will come across as triumphalistic to some. There are people who we believe are not adhering to the gospel completely as we understand it, as has been affirmed through the centuries from the beginning of the church established at Pentecost. I mean, that's what we believe. And there are some people who identify themselves as Christian who say that Jesus was not God, was not the second person of the Trinity, that all of that language is either poetic or you all are misunderstanding it, we'll tell you better from our reason that that can't be true. So something happened at Jesus' baptism where, poof, he's made Son of God. That actually is a heresy that goes back to the very early church that rears its ugly head nowadays in contemporary America. And it's a sad thing that I have to say we Orthodox and Catholic Christians, and there are many Protestant churches that believe this as well, affirm that Jesus is God, that he was outside of time as the second person in the Trinity and still is, and became human fully in a way that we don't understand. To know what that means is to mean that we are equal with God. Well, we're not. And so here we are affirming the mystery, taking part in the mystery, having the gift of being included in the mystery, and with the best of our faculties, having a sense of what that means as we participate in the mystery, and yet not know what that completely means. I'm sad, though, that that had to be included in the Orthodox Study Bible commentary, because it's telling me that it's a real problem. And my guess is, because I know who some of the people are that have written some of these commentaries, many of them entered Orthodoxy from another Christian group, and some of these Christian groups held theology close to the Orthodox, which is why many of them became Orthodox, and they just wanted more of it. But I'm sure they've had some upfront and personal contact with people who believed otherwise, and they just wanted to make sure that was in there, that the Orthodox and the Catholics believe that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. How? That's God's business, but it has to do with God's utter humility, his kenosis, and love for us, that this all occurred.
That's another maybe topic for conversation, who Christ was. Like you said during the break, that your accomplished doctorate in theology was going to be on this topic, who was Christ, because he has been misunderstood by many, many denominations, and even it has become a problem between major churches.
Thank you for honoring that just now.
Yes. The other question I would like to ask is, we spoke about the fear that the disciples had. We kind of tried to explain why they were afraid, because it was unknown, and so on and so forth. But one message that we hear here is, rise and don't be afraid. I think that's a message not for only the disciples, but also for us.
Very important. Because I'm always afraid. I'm afraid of sometimes the next day. You know, where's my life going? What choices am I going to make? Time and life is finite. Everything we have is a gift. And so what am I called to do with my life today? And so how am I supposed to be an authentic person, an authentic me in the presence of God in my everyday life as I show up for it? And am I doing the right thing? And it's scary because I've never been here before. But what helps me relax is, well, no one else has been here before. And that over and over and over again you hear in the scriptures, you read in the scriptures, rise and don't be afraid. When the angel appeared to Mary and was about to ask her if she would be the mother of God, one of the first things he says to her is, do not fear. And there are other stories from the scriptures where one of the first things the angelic presence will say at one point, or even the Lord in certain occasions, do not fear. Because our first reaction is, when we're confronted with something bigger than ourselves, to recoil in fear. That's normal. God knows us from the inside out. We've said this many times before. And what's wonderful is we can still be full of fear and we're still held in the center of the palm of the loving God's hand. So just breathe and just trust and see what happens next, and see what happens next. And by doing that, we trust the love of God, which is far more powerful than we are, to act around us and within us in ways we do not understand. So sometimes it's important for us to be like little children. Sometimes we have to be like little toddlers, where we hold the 18-month-old, the 2-year-old, the 3-year-old, who holds mommy's and daddy's hand and is led where we need to be led by the loving parent, by the loving God. And so that's what rise and do not be afraid means for me. It means rise and trust. Be like a child. Have that childlike faith. Not childish, which is selfish and egocentric and of the fallen ego, but innocent, in that innocence of the child, trusting the loving God, taking us where He wants to take us.
Mm-hmm. There are many fears with what if I lose my job tomorrow? What if this? What if that? What if that? Like those paper tigers that you keep mentioning about are always around us and keep us in fear. And what God wants us from us is, don't be afraid. It will be okay. Now, what would be your comment about fear as a psychologist? If somebody becomes an addict of something, for example, cigarettes, what I have learned growing up as a child is because you're afraid your friends won't approve of you if you don't do the same thing that they are doing. I can bring an example. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I was in the forest, in the woods with my friend. Most of my friends were smoking already at that age, 12, 13 years old. And this friend of mine took out cigarettes and started smoking. And then he offered me. And I took it. I tried it as everybody else. The first time you try to smoke, your head starts spinning. And that's what I had the experience. And I said, why would you do this? And I gave it to him back. And he said, no, try again. It's the first time, second time, third time, and then we'll get better. I said, no, I don't want it, and I'm not going to try it again anymore in my life. And he started teasing me. He said, we'll see. We'll grow up, and you will see that you will smoke. Everybody smokes. What are you talking about? How can you be a grown-up man and not smoke? At the moment, it was painful, because this was one of my few friends who was kind of separating himself from me. He is a smoker. He's a part of the large group.
In crowd, right?
Yes, and I am alone here. And there was a fear of being alone. There was a fear of being laughed at. There were many fears.
Because of the pain. Mm-hmm. The pain of isolation, the pain of rejection, the pain of being ridiculed by someone you love. You loved this friend. And he was making choices so that he would rather be included in the in crowd, whatever that meant, at your expense. And so the pain of understanding you were being betrayed at that moment. I don't know what's happened with that friend. Maybe you're still very close. I pray.
I haven't seen him for...
Bless him, wherever he is. Bless him. Okay, for centuries. Bless him wherever he is. And the whole crowd. But it's the pain that we're afraid of most of the time. One of the few things Freud says that I agree with, it's a healthy thing to want to avoid pain and sickness. It's a healthy thing. So that's a healthy reaction most people have, that they don't want to experience that pain. And so we have fear around pain. It's good to encourage people not to willy-nilly run into every painful situation that presents itself to us. It is okay, and it is a good thing to want to avoid pain. That's a healthy fear. In fact, the Greek word for fear has a double meaning. It has fear as you're describing it, being afraid of, recoiling, and doesn't feel good. But fear, phobos is the Greek word, also means awe, ultimate respect. In fact, in the liturgy, in Greek, we say, with fear and love, draw near to the communion. This is that communion time. So and many people hear fear when it's said in English, and they think, how are we supposed to be afraid of God and love God? Well, they're forgetting that it's not necessarily that negative fear so much. That might be in the room a little bit, but to the dimension of fear that refers to phovo, that refers to awe, being just amazed and astounded, and love draw near. And so, in a sense, and you're asking me what happens when people come to see me and they're afraid, they want to talk to me and they're afraid. And I was thinking, what's one of the common denominators? And one of the common denominators is trust. They trust that the person in the room that they're sharing their pain with or their fears with can contain it, can be with them through the fear, or has been there in some way or knows what to do so that this fear doesn't contain them, does not limit them. So that might be a lesson that all of us can learn when we think about our fears and about our pain. We turn to God because He can contain. He can hold us through this. How? I don't know. It's always new every time.
When you were explaining that they trust and they can share, I was also thinking about the fear of sharing. I remember you mentioned before that if you want to get rid of one sin or addiction or whatever, first thing is you have to name it, you have to face it and recognize that it exists. And one way of doing this is to confess about it. Mm-hmm. But what I have felt that saying this is accompanied with fear. This is my favorite priest, for example. Now, if I tell him that I'm an idiot, what is he going to think about me? That's a fear. Of course, we don't encounter the fact that he's the priest he is called for. This is his profession. He's a psychologist or she's a psychologist. She's here to help me, not to change his opinion or her opinion about me. That opinion is not what it matters, but what I become later on. But yet, in that first moment, there is a fear.
It's an act of trust. And when we trust, we reveal ourselves. We make ourselves vulnerable in a way that wasn't happening before. And so when you reached out to this priest to possibly be your spiritual director, you were opening up your whole heart and your whole self. And I'm sure you could feel yourself quivering in one way or other because you made yourself transparent. In a sense, what we're doing here, I mean, sure, we're coming with our notes, but we're doing this is an unscripted conversation. And sure, it's kind of theologically deep, but we're really being ourselves with each other and with the audience. And in a sense, we are revealing ourselves. We are making ourselves vulnerable because nothing is scripted. We are really being real as best as we can in the presence of God and one another and with the audience. And so there's a kind of vulnerability that, yeah, every time I come to the studio, I have some fear in me because I don't know what's going to happen next. And so, but that's a gift. And that's an act of trust. And it's saying, that's how we will grow in communion with God. That ever opening, ever offering of unconditional trust in the direction of love with a capital L is how we go through it.
When they leave with Christ, the apostles, they speak about Elijah. For some reason they don't speak about Moses, but Elijah, because that was probably a controversial issue at the time regarding the fact that when John the Baptist was beheaded, even the king was thinking, who is this? Is this Elijah that was supposed to come? And Christ confirms here that Elijah has come.
Or the spirit of Elijah.
Yes, and then the next thing is that Malachi prophesied about this. Right. And he didn't say that Elijah will come in person.
When you break down the translation of what is prophesied by Malachi, it's in the spirit of Elijah. Mm-hmm. But what's wonderful is it's kind of like in the gospel, all the bases are covered. That St. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah, preparing the way of he whose shoes he is not worthy to untie. And just for safe measure, here boys, here girls, on the mountain, here's Elijah himself. That is a showing to his disciples and all of us that Jesus Christ is the culmination of the law and all the prophets, with whom we are in communion even now as the church.
So what was Elijah's power and Elijah's spirit that John the Baptist came with?
If we were to study the prophet Elijah's life more deeply, and so I'm just going on what I remember from my ancient seminary studies, one of his major thrusts of his message was the coming of the Messiah, was the coming of God, and the mercy of God that's being rained on Israel and all the world. And he's the only prophet, the only person in the Old Testament that never experienced death as we know it. Everybody else died and was buried. Elijah, as we know from the scriptures, was taken up in the heavens in a fiery chariot. And I think one reason why the ancients had been fascinated by his mission on this earth is because he never completed it. And so his mission was still open-ended. And so his mission was completed with the coming of St. John the Baptist and the coming of the Lord. And then here he is saying, all done.
I would like you to a little bit to speak about the Holy Trinity that was manifested. Many other religions of the world claim that they believe in same God. Even I remember one of the church fathers say that God revealed himself not only through the Old Testament to the Jews, but he revealed himself through all the religions, even through the pagan religions, to all the world, everywhere, to prepare everybody for the coming of the Christ. From the Christian perspective, we understand it as a Trinity.
Recap from what we said in our previous conversation about how this feast, the Feast of the Transfiguration, is like the second bookend to the first bookend, which is the Feast of the Theophany, or the Epiphany, the baptism of Christ at the River Jordan. And in both, the Lord is a central figure, and at the River Jordan, we hear God the Father's voice say, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased," and that the Spirit appears, the Holy Spirit appears as a dove. Not that he was a dove, but as a dove. It was the best word that human speech could convey to say what was seen. Or like at Pentecost, the Greek does not say the Holy Spirit descended on the multitude, the believers that were there, was flame itself. It came as a flame. In other words, it was the best word that they could find to describe what had rested on the heads of all the believers. So the Trinity is manifested for the first time in the Lord's ministry at the baptism. And again, the Trinity is manifested at the end of his teaching ministry at the Transfiguration. The Spirit is seen as the cloud this time that surrounded Jesus. And then God the Father's voice again is heard. "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And so what does this mean for Christians? In a sense, we're a religion that doesn't make sense. You know, we believe it. Each Father, Son, and Spirit is God? Yes. Well, do we believe in three gods? No. But we would say 1 and 1 and 1 equals 1. And so this, again, is pointing to the mystery of what it means to bear witness to this God of love, who is a person, in fact, is a community of persons who are one and yet a community, calling us to grow in community, in communion with him. The Greek word for community and the Greek word for communion is the same word, koinonia. And so to grow in this relationship with God, even with our own selves, to treat ourselves the way God wants us to treat ourselves, and one another in creation, is the vocation for all of us.
Thank you, Presbytera, for the wonderful conversation. It was very interesting. I learned things that I never even thought about before. Thank you, dear audience, for being with us and following our conversations. We have already made over 30 conversations, and I want to thank you for participating. Thank you very much, and thank you, dear audience.